The spring of 1884 arrived late to the Wind River Basin the way it always did in Wyoming. Cold held onto the ground longer than it had any right to. Frost still crept across the window glass at night, even after the calendar said March. When warmth finally came, it came fast, and every person in the valley knew better than to waste a single hour of it. That was what made what Nora Halstead was doing so difficult to understand. She was planting sunflowers. Not in a garden, not beside a fence where they might look cheerful from the road. She was pressing seeds into the soil directly against the foundation logs of her cabin, inches from the wall, forming a narrow ring around the entire structure. North wall, south wall, east wall, west. Every side. She worked without hurrying and without explaining herself to anyone who slowed their wagon on the road to watch. Her daughter Wren moved behind her, 9 years old and serious about her task, carrying a small cloth sack of seeds and passing them forward one at a time. The old brown dog Biscuit lay in a patch of shade near the porch steps, watching them both with the patient attention of an animal who had decided long ago that his only real job was to remain nearby. By the end of the first week, the ring of seeds was complete. By the second week, the first green shoots had broken the surface. That was when people in the Wind River Basin began paying attention, because in Wyoming in 1884, warm days were not decoration. Warm days were survival. Every hour the sun held above the mountains was an hour that could go toward repairing a roof, splitting firewood, filling a root cellar, or mending the gaps in cabin walls that had spent another winter cracking and shrinking in the cold. Every hour spent on the wrong task was an hour that could become a problem once the snow returned. And snow always returned. The talk began at the trading post the way most talk in the valley did. A man mentioned what he had seen riding past the Halstead place. Another man confirmed it. Someone laughed. Someone else offered an explanation and then withdrew it when he realized he did not have one. The story moved from the trading post to the church, then from the church to the sawmill, where men gathered in the long afternoon waiting for lumber orders and found that discussing other people's decisions helped pass the time. Before long, the cabin had a name, the Sunflower Widow's Cabin. Owen Brace, who had built more than 20 structures across Wyoming and Colorado, and knew wood the way a doctor knows bones, called it a waste of good growing weather the first time he heard about it. Silas Crow, who ran sheep on the land directly east of the Halstead property, shook his head and said nothing at all, which in its own way was a judgment. And Franklin Holt, who controlled most of the valley's winter supply credit from behind the counter of his dry goods store, smiled the kind of smile that did not require a punchline. Nora heard the nickname. Everyone did. The valley was too small for anything to stay quiet for long. She kept planting. Wren heard it too at church on Sunday, delivered in the careless way adults sometimes say things they believe children cannot fully understand. She said nothing on the walk home. She carried her coat over her arm and watched the ground pass beneath her boots and thought whatever 9-year-old children think when the world offers them something they cannot yet sort out. That evening, while the last light faded from the western ridge and the basin settled into the particular blue quiet that came before dark, Wren stood at the window and looked out at the young shoots just visible in the dimming light. She asked whether her father would have liked the flowers. The room held the question for a long moment. Nora was working a piece of cord around a loose fence rail that she had brought inside to repair. Her hands continued moving for a few seconds after the question arrived. Then she set the cord and the rail down across her knees and looked toward the window, toward the thin green line of plants that had come up along the base of the cabin wall. She did not answer right away. When she spoke, she did not answer the question directly. Instead, she told Wren something she had not told anyone in the valley, not Owen Brace, when he came to warn her, not Silas Crow, when he watched from the fence line, not any of the women at church who had found gentle ways of suggesting she might reconsider. She told Wren about James's mother. The woman had come to Colorado Territory as a young girl, part of a German settlement in the eastern foothills. She had grown old in that country, raised children in it, buried a husband in it, and learned certain things about surviving winter in high elevation that had not come from books or from advice, but from decades of watching what worked and what did not. She had shared those things with Nora, the same way she shared most things, not as lessons, not as instructions, but in the middle of doing something else, her hands always occupied her eyes, always on the work. Nora remembered one afternoon in particular. They had been mending a section of fence together in the autumn chill, and the old woman had said something in the offhand way of a person describing weather or the price of flour. The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first. At the time, Nora had thought it sounded like the kind of thing old women said, a saying passed down through enough generations that its original meaning had worn smooth. She had nodded and kept working and filed it somewhere in the back of her memory under the category of things she might think about later. Later had arrived. She had stood in the yard of the Halstead cabin on a February morning 4 months after James had walked into a whiteout and not walked back out, and she had felt the wind come off the northern slope and press itself against the cabin wall with a focused, deliberate force. She had put her palm flat against the logs and felt the cold moving through them with barely any resistance at all. She had looked at the wall and thought about what the old woman had said. And then she had started thinking about sunflowers. While she told Wren the story, she rose from her chair and opened the bottom drawer of the chest near the bedroom door. She reached past folded cloth and a tin box and lifted out a small book with a dark cover slightly warped at one corner. It had belonged to James. He had bought it from the general store in the spring of the year he died, meaning to use it for something he never specified. The pages were still blank. Nora set it on the table and opened it to the first page. She wrote the date. She wrote the morning temperature as she remembered it from the small glass thermometer that hung on the wall opposite the stove. She wrote the number of logs she had burned since the previous evening. Then she closed the book and set it on the corner of the table where she could see it from the stove. Wren watched all of this without asking any more questions. Outside in the thin last light, the green shoots stood against the cabin wall like the beginning of something that had not yet shown its shape. The summer moved the way Wyoming summers did, quickly and without apology. The sunflowers came up fast once the soil warmed. By July, they had passed the level of the windowsills. By August, they had grown tall enough that passing wagons could not see the lower half of the cabin walls at all. That was when Owen Brace decided to say something directly. He was a careful man, not a cruel one. He had spent 30 years working with wood, and 30 years of working with wood had taught him that most problems announced themselves slowly, and that people who did not listen the first time generally listened after the damage appeared. He did not ride to the Halstead place out of meanness. He rode there because he had seen what moisture did to log cabins, and he believed he was doing Nora Halstead a service by saying so before it was too late. He dismounted at the edge of the sunflower row and studied it for a moment. The plants were thick-stemmed and heavy-headed, their faces turned to follow the afternoon light. They grew so close to the cabin wall that a man could not pass between the outer row and the logs without turning sideways. Nora was working along the north wall when he arrived. She glanced at him and kept working. Owen rested his arm across the saddle horn the way men do when they intend to have a conversation rather than just a word. He said she was creating problems for herself. He said it the way he would have said it to anyone, plainly, without softening it into something it was not. He pointed at the plants crowding the wall and explained that green things held moisture, and moisture held against wood was the beginning of rot. He had pulled apart enough failed cabins to know exactly what rot looked like from the inside, how it moved slowly at first, and then all at once how it weakened a wall long before the wall showed any sign of weakness. He said Silas Crow's barn had gone that way, though he did not say it to embarrass anyone. Then he mentioned the mice. Mice always came, he said. That was simply true and not worth arguing about. Give a mouse enough cover in a warm wall nearby, and the mouse would move in before the first hard frost. Dense vegetation against a foundation was an invitation, and winter was not a season for invitations. He finished by saying that the wood needed to breathe. Nora had stopped tying a cord between two stalks while he spoke. She listened with the still expression she often wore, the one that gave nothing away about whether she was persuaded or simply waiting for a person to finish. When he was done, she looked at the row she had spent months growing, then at the cabin logs behind it, then back at the row. She turned and continued with the cord she had been tying. Owen waited for something more. When nothing came, he gathered himself in the way a man does when the conversation has ended in a direction he did not intend, and he rode away with the firm conviction that winter would settle the matter without any further opinion from him. Silas Crow, who happened to be near enough to the fence line to have heard most of that exchange, found himself agreeing with the carpenter. He said as much to his wife that evening. She said less than he expected her to. August brought the wind. It came from the western ridges one afternoon without much warning, the kind of gust that moved faster than the sky appeared to be moving, that arrived as a wall of pressure before it arrived as sound. Dust lifted from the open ground and moved sideways. A section of fencing near the creek folded over as though it had simply decided to lie down. Loose boards across the valley rattled and swung. When the wind reached the Halstead cabin, it hit the western row of sunflowers head-on. The plants were tall and top-heavy with their seed heads, and they went down quickly, the whole western side of the ring collapsing against the ground in a long, broken line. Stalks snapped near the base. The heavy heads pulled the upper portions over and held them there. When the gusts finally eased, almost a third of the western row lay flat, broken stems stretched across the dirt in a tangle. Silas Crow rode past late that afternoon and studied the damage for a long moment without stopping. He shook his head slowly, the way a man does when a thing he expected has finally arrived, and he continued on. By morning, Nora was already outside. She had been working before first light, moving along the western row by feel in the gray pre-dawn, lifting damaged stalks and testing each one. Some were bent, but not broken at the root, and these she raised carefully and pressed new wooden stakes into the ground beside them. Others had snapped entirely, and she removed them, carrying them to the side of the house. Where the row had been dense enough, she tied cord between the remaining stems, creating a web of connection so that the plants could share the force of the next wind rather than each facing it alone. Biscuit moved through the work with her nosing around the fallen stalks, occasionally redirecting a wandering sheep that had come through a gap in the fence to investigate. Wren came out when the sun was fully up and worked beside her mother without being asked, carrying replacement plants from the far end of the row where they had grown thickest. The repairs took 3 days. When they were finished, the western row did not look identical to what it had been. The spacing was different in places. The cord between the plants was visible in a way it had not been before, but the row stood, and in certain stretches where the new stakes and the cord had reinforced the original planting, it stood more firmly than it ever had. Silas noticed this when he rode by again at the end of the week. He slowed his horse and looked at the row for a long moment. He did not say anything. He continued on. Owen Brace heard about the collapse and the repairs and felt a complicated thing which he resolved into silence. It was not long after the western row was restored that Franklin Holt came to the Halstead place. He came alone on a Tuesday afternoon, which was the day he usually rode his circuit of the valley's smaller homesteads. He was not an unkind man in the way that some men are unkind openly and without apology. He was the kind of man who made decisions that were painful for others and called those decisions practical. He controlled the winter supply credit that most families in the valley relied upon to see them through the months when nothing grew and nothing could be earned, and he controlled it the way a man controls a resource he has decided he is right to control. He dismounted at the gate and walked to where Nora was working along the north wall. He did not start with the sunflowers. He started with the summer, with how it had gone for most families, with the price of grain at the last market, and what it meant for the coming months. He was good at starting with something else. Then he arrived at the point of his visit the way he always arrived at the point, directly and without ornamentation. He said he would not be extending her winter credit. He said it quietly, the way difficult things are sometimes said quietly to suggest they are reasonable. He said she had spent the growing season on something that would not feed her family, or keep her animals, or improve her property in any way that a sensible person could calculate. He said he ran a business, and a business required him to make judgments about the people who depended on it. And his judgment in this case was that she had made choices that put her position at risk. He was not wrong that it was his credit to extend or withhold. That part was simply true. Nora did not look up from the cord she was tying for a long moment. The basin was quiet around them. A meadowlark called from somewhere past the south fence and fell silent. Biscuit lifted his head from where he lay near the porch steps and then lowered it again. Then she looked at Franklin Holt directly. She did not argue. She did not explain the sunflowers or the German settlement in Colorado or what James's mother had said about the cold hunting walls. She did not tell him about the book of temperature readings on the corner of her table or what she intended to prove with it. She said nothing. Franklin Holt held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once and walked back to his horse. He was halfway to the gate when she spoke. She said she understood. Nothing else. Just those 2 words, said the way a person says something they mean in more than one direction at once. Franklin mounted and rode out through the gate. Nora watched him go for exactly as long as it took to register that he was leaving. Then she turned back to the north wall and finished tying the cord. The sunflowers kept growing. By the end of August, the tallest had reached the lower edge of the roofline. Their faces were heavy and beginning to bow with the weight of developing seeds. The green had started to shade toward yellow at the edges of the leaves. The whole ring had taken on a different quality, less like a garden and more like a structure, a thing with intention and weight and mass. People in the valley had largely stopped laughing by then. The laugh requires a certain energy to sustain, and sustaining it against a wall of continued quiet effort requires more energy than most people are willing to spend. What replaced the laughter was something closer to watchfulness. A few people had begun to wonder in the cautious way that people wonder about things they are not yet willing to admit, wondering about whether the woman knew something they did not. One evening at the end of August, as the sun pulled the last of its color down behind the western ridge, Nora sat at the table and opened James's book. She wrote the date. She wrote the temperature. She wrote the number of logs. She looked at the entries she had been making for months, the careful columns of numbers that documented what was happening inside the cabin and outside it. Then she looked at the coat hanging on the hook behind the door. James had bought it the winter before he dyed heavy canvas with a wool lining, the kind of coat built to last longer than any single winter. It had lasted several winters. It would probably last several more. She looked at it for a moment the way she sometimes did, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of attention that was only possible when a person is no longer trying to manage what they feel. Then she closed the book and set it in its corner. Outside, the sunflowers waited. The wind came off the ridge in small gusts, moving through the seed heads with a dry, papery sound. Somewhere east of the fence line, one of Silas Crow's sheep moved in the dark, and then was still. The growing season was ending. What came next would not be growing. Late summer slipped into September without ceremony. The meadowlarks grew quieter. The light changed its angle, arriving lower each morning, cutting longer shadows across the valley floor by early afternoon. The sunflowers darkened from their summer yellow into something drier and deeper, the seeds filling out in their heads, the stalks beginning their long, slow stiffening toward the state that would make them useful for what Nora had always intended. It was in those last warm days, while the basin still held some memory of summer heat, that Silas Crow finally said something directly to her. He had been watching the whole enterprise from his fence line for months. He had heard the conversation with Owen Brace. He had seen the western row collapse and rise again. He had watched the work continue through heat and dust and wind without ever wavering in its direction. He was not a man who easily changed his mind, but he was a man who respected persistence in the same reluctant way a person respects a river that keeps finding its way around whatever you put in front of it. He stopped at the fence one morning while she was working along the east side and asked the question plainly. What were the flowers for? Nora pressed another seed into the ground before she answered. She said they were for the cabin. No explanation, no argument, no defense of the months of work, or the credit she no longer had, or the laughter that had followed her through the summer like a persistent echo. Just those 4 words delivered without heat, without apology, and without any apparent concern for what he would make of them. Silas looked at the wall. He looked at the seeds. He looked at the woman pressing them into the ground with the same methodical care she had been pressing them since spring. He rode away with the answer which explained less than the question had. By the time the first frost touched the basin floor, the sunflowers had taken on their final form. Tall, dense, heavy-headed, the whole ring surrounding the cabin like a strange amber fence. The seed faces turned in all directions, now following no particular light. They were something between alive and not alive, holding their structure, but losing their green, moving toward the state that winter would demand they reach. Nora looked at them one evening and understood that the growing was finished. The building was about to begin. September left the Wind River Basin the way a cautious man leaves a room slowly without drawing attention to the departure. The warmth did not vanish all at once. It retreated by degrees. A few minutes of daylight surrendered each afternoon, a few more degrees of cold settling into the nights, the frost line pushing a little deeper into the ground with each passing week. By the time October arrived, the change was no longer subtle. It was a fact. Nora had been preparing for it since spring. The harvest began on a dry morning when the air carried that particular edge that comes before the season fully turns cold enough to remind you of what is coming, but not yet cold enough to make you afraid of it. She moved through the ring of sunflowers with a calm efficiency that Wren had come to recognize as her mother's working mode, not hurried, not casual, but precise in a way that suggested every motion had been considered before it was made. She cut the seed heads that were fullest and driest and carried them to the cloth sacks she had laid open near the porch. These she would store for spring planting, enough to ring the cabin again next year, enough to share with anyone who asked, though she did not yet know if anyone would. The rest she left attached to their stalks. The plants still had a purpose. It was simply a different purpose than the one they had served through the summer. Wren worked beside her without being directed, carrying armloads of the cut plants from one side of the cabin to the other, her boots leaving small prints in the frost-softened earth. Biscuit followed the work the way he always followed work, circling the perimeter, pausing to sniff at things that had no apparent significance, occasionally pressing his nose against Wren's leg in the way that seemed to mean he was still there and still paying attention. The construction of the outer layer began that afternoon. Nora tied the first bundle herself, a dense sheaf of dried stalks bound together with cord at the top, the middle, and the base, then pressed against the cabin logs with the flat face of the stalks flush against the wood. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she adjusted the angle slightly, leaning the bundle out at the bottom just enough to create a narrow channel of air between the stalks and the log wall beneath. She looked at it again. She pressed the bundle back into place. Wren watched this adjustment without asking about it. The bundle stayed where Nora left it. Over the following days, the work expanded around the cabin in both directions from that first bundle. Nora moved along the north wall first, which was the wall that would face the worst of what Wyoming winters typically sent down from the northern slopes. She worked methodically, each bundle tied and placed, and checked the cord wrapped in the same pattern, each time the air channel preserved at every point. The wall behind the work disappeared gradually, log by log, until by the end of the first week, the north face of the cabin had vanished beneath a dense covering of dried stalks, leaves, hardened seed heads woven into open spaces in layered fiber that trapped air, the way a loosely woven blanket traps warmth. Wren spent her afternoons carrying materials. She did not complain about this. She was a practical child in the way that children raised in frontier households often become practical, not because they are told to be, but because the environment makes impracticality too expensive to sustain. She watched her mother's hands and tried to understand the pattern in them. One afternoon she asked why the bundles were not pressed flat against the wall. Nora showed her rather than explaining. She held a bundle tight against the log so that no space remained between the stalks and the wood. Then she held it at the slight outward angle that she had been using from the beginning. She asked Wren which one felt colder at the logs behind it when she pressed her palm there. Wren pressed her hand against the logs in both positions. She thought about it for a moment. The one with the space, she said. Nora nodded. She tied the bundle at the angle and moved to the next one. It was the middle of October when the trouble with the mice began. Wren found the signs first, the small scattered debris near the base of the western section, the telltale disturbance in the tightly packed outer layer where something had been pushing through the material from outside. She called her mother over without drama and pointed to the area without commentary, which was the way the two of them generally communicated when something needed to be addressed. Nora crouched and examined the section carefully. She pulled the outer layer apart at the disturbed point and found the beginning of a nest, a small hollow carved into the middle of the dried stalks, with the characteristic tidiness that mice bring to such things, scraps of plant fiber arranged into a cup, a few seeds cached at the edge. She looked at it for a long moment. Owen Brace had predicted this. He had been right about it. That was simply a fact, and Nora had no particular interest in facts that were inconvenient. She accepted it the way she accepted hard weather, as a condition to be dealt with rather than a grievance to be held. She pulled the entire section apart that afternoon, working backwards from the damage until she reached material that was undisturbed and solid. Several hours of finished work came apart in her hands. She set the compromised bundles aside and examined the exposed wall beneath, running her fingers along the logs and checking the chinking between them for any additional damage. There was none. Then she went looking for sage. The dried sage grew in patches across the open ground between the cabin and the creek, shorter now than it had been in summer, but still fragrant when the leaves were crushed between the fingers. She gathered armloads of it along with dried sweet grass from the lower ground near the fence line, carrying the material back in successive trips until she had enough to work with. She packed the fragrant material into the rebuilt section at every point where the outer bundles met the ground and at every gap she could identify in the lower portions of the structure. The smell of it was sharp and clean in the cold air. Wren helped press it into the deeper spaces, her smaller hands reaching into gaps that Nora's could not. Within a week, the signs of nesting were gone. A week after that, they did not return. Owen Brace heard about the mice through the ordinary channels by which information moved in the valley, which were various and largely invisible. He felt something complicated when he heard that the infestation had been dealt with using sage and sweetgrass. He recognized that his warning had been accurate, and that the problem had been solved, and he understood that both of these things could be true simultaneously. He resolved this into silence the way he resolved most complicated things. The work on the outer layer continued through October and into November. Each day brought the structure closer to what Nora had been building toward since spring, and each day also brought the weather closer to what the structure would need to withstand. The race between the two was not dramatic. It did not have the quality of crisis. It had the quality of something much harder to sustain, sustained effort, repeated over many weeks in cold that increased by small increments and never gave anything back. Wren kept carrying bundles. Biscuit kept following. The book on the corner of the table kept receiving new entries every morning and every evening, the columns of numbers growing longer, the record of what was happening inside the cabin accumulating with a patience that matched the patience of the work outside. It was a Tuesday night in early November when Biscuit refused to come inside. He had been given every opportunity. Wren had held the door open and called to him twice. Nora had stood on the porch in the cold and watched him for a moment, reading something in the way he was moving that she could not yet name. He was not distressed in the way dogs become distressed by things they are afraid of. He was focused, which was different. He moved along the base of the north wall with his nose close to the ground, stopping at certain points and returning to them, his attention fixed on something that was not visible. Nora watched him for a while and then went inside and let him stay out. In the morning, she followed the path he had traveled. She moved along the north wall, slowly pressing her hand against the outer surface of the stalks and running it across the face of the layer, the way a doctor runs a hand along a patient's side, feeling for something that the eye cannot find. Most of the surface was solid, and even the bundles packed firmly enough to resist the pressure of her palm without giving. Then she found it. It was not visible from outside. The outer layer looked the same at that point as it did everywhere else. But when she pressed her hand against the surface and applied slow, even pressure, something shifted slightly behind it, a flex that should not have been there, a giving quality that indicated an open space behind the face of the stalks. She began removing the outer layer at that point. The bundles came apart in her hands, and as they did, the space revealed itself. A channel nearly 2 feet long running vertically between the inner face of the outer layer and the cabin logs behind it. It was narrow, but it was open, the kind of gap that moving air finds and accelerates through, rather than dispersing around a corridor for the wind instead of a barrier to it. From the outside, it was completely hidden. From the inside, it would have allowed a direct line of cold air to reach the logs at the point where the north wall faced the worst of what the winter would send. Nora stood and looked at it. Then she began dismantling the surrounding area, pulling apart the work of 2 weeks, setting the bundles carefully to the side in the order she removed them so that she could understand how the gap had formed. It had been a matter of angle, a slight misalignment in 2 adjacent bundles that had created a void at their junction, invisible from either face but present through the full depth of the layer. Wren came out while the dismantling was still underway and stood watching. By the time the rebuilt section was finished, the light had moved most of the way across the sky. Nora tied the last cord and stepped back. She looked at the wall. Wren looked at the wall. There was nothing visible about it that distinguished it from the sections on either side. Wren said it looked exactly the same as before. Nora was quiet for a moment. A wind moved through the valley from the north, one of the cold preview winds that November sends ahead of itself like scouts tasting the temperature of the air above the basin floor. She tilted her head slightly as though listening to something at the edge of hearing. Then she said that the wind would know. Wren looked at the wall once more and then looked at her mother, and did not say anything else. Ezra Voss came on a Thursday. He did not send word ahead of time. He did not have the habit of announcing himself. He appeared on the road in the middle of the morning, a thin figure on a gray horse moving at the unhurried pace of a man who has long since stopped being in a hurry because he has understood that weather and time do not particularly care about the schedules of men. He was nearly 70. He had lived in the Wind River Basin since before most of the people in it had been born. He had watched more winters move through that valley than any other living person, and he had learned to read them the way some men read faces, by looking past the surface to the structure beneath. People in the valley did not always listen to Ezra Voss, but when something he had predicted came true, which happened with a regularity that did not invite argument, they remembered that they had not listened. He dismounted at the gate without being invited and walked around the cabin. He said nothing while he walked. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the structure, moving his eyes along the outer surface of the stalks, the way a person reads something they want to understand rather than something they merely want to get through. He stopped at the north wall for a longer time than he stopped anywhere else. He pressed his hand against the outer layer, held it there, and looked at the wall without expression. Then he crouched at the base of the north wall and examined the gap between the bottom of the outer layer and the ground, checking whether the structure was sealed at the foundation or whether cold air could move beneath it. Nora had dealt with this in October, packing the base with a double layer of material and pressing it tight to the ground. Ezra looked at it closely. He stood again and looked at the overall depth of the layer, the way it met the roof line, the placement of the bundles at the corners where two walls met. These were the points of vulnerability in any structure, the places where force concentrated, where separate elements joined, and the joint was always weaker than the continuous material on either side. Then he stopped near the doorway and looked at Nora for the first time since arriving. He asked who had taught her. She said her husband's mother. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man making a calculation that he does not intend to share. Then he nodded once slowly, the way people nod when something confirms a thing they had suspected but not yet confirmed. He walked to his horse and mounted without another word. Before he turned the horse toward the road, he looked north. The mountains that normally defined the horizon in that direction had disappeared behind a curtain of gray that sat lower than clouds usually sat and moved with a heaviness that was different from ordinary cloud movement. It was the kind of sky that Ezra Voss had learned to take seriously over the course of decades, watching Wyoming weather arrange itself into the configurations that preceded serious winters. He looked at it for a moment. Then he rode away without looking back. He did not laugh. He did not offer reassurance. He did not say that the work was good or that the coming winter would be manageable. He said none of those things. But a man who had spent 50 years learning to read what the sky above Wyoming was planning had examined the sunflower wall carefully and had found nothing to laugh at. In a valley where Ezra Voss's opinion carried the weight it carried that meant something. November moved through the basin with a steady accumulating seriousness. The morning temperatures recorded in James's book dropped each week, not dramatically but consistently, each new entry pulling slightly further from the warmth of the previous month. The ground froze solid by the third week. Ice appeared on the creek that did not melt back during the day. The outer layer was finished by the middle of November. Nora walked around the completed structure one evening as the light failed, pressing her hand against the surface at different points, checking the consistency of the depth feeling for any spot where the packed material gave way too easily. She found two places that needed additional bundles and added them. She found one binding on the east wall that had loosened and retied it. When she was finished, she stood in the yard and looked at what the cabin had become. It was no longer a cabin in the ordinary sense. The walls had disappeared beneath the outer layer entirely. The chimney rose from a mass of dried organic material that covered the structure from the ground to the eaves. A narrow passage to the door had been left clear. The windows were visible behind recessed sections of the layer. Everything else was stalks, seed heads, dried leaves, cord fiber, and the countless small air pockets preserved within the mass. From the road, it resembled nothing so much as a very large, very dense haystack that someone had constructed around a house. Franklin Holt had ridden past 2 days earlier and seen it in its nearly completed state. He had laughed. It had been a genuine laugh, the kind that requires no audience, and it had carried across the cold air to where Nora was working along the east side. The phrase he had used had reached her clearly. The biggest haystack in Wyoming. She had heard it. She had continued tying a cord between two bundles. She had recorded the morning's temperature in James's book that evening, as she did every evening. The book was accumulating something more than numbers. It was accumulating a record of two parallel things: what was happening inside the cabin and what the world outside the cabin was doing. The gap between those two things was the entire point. Every entry was evidence. Every entry was an argument being constructed over time in the only language that the Valley's Franklin Holtz and Owen Braces and Silas Crows actually trusted, which was not explanation or defense or persuasion, but result. Wren came outside and stood next to her mother in the yard, both of them looking at the structure in the failing light. She asked what it felt like. Nora was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving across the surface of the outer layer, checking it the way she checked it every time she looked at it, for gaps, for looseness, for anything that needed attention. "It feels like being ready," she said. Inside the cabin, Biscuit lay near the door with his chin on his front paws, his eyes half open, his ears moving slightly at sounds from outside that neither Nora nor Wren could hear. Somewhere to the north, beyond the mountains that had disappeared again behind their curtain of gray, something was organizing itself. Something large and cold and patient was finding its shape. The geese had been gone for 2 weeks. The sky above the basin was empty in the way that skies become empty when the things that knew enough to leave have left. In the corner of the table, James's book waited with its columns of numbers and its careful dates, its record of every cold morning and every bundle of firewood, the evidence of a whole season's work distilled into figures that could be read and compared and understood by anyone willing to sit down and look at them honestly. Winter was no longer something coming. It was something arrived, standing just beyond the northern mountains, gathering the particular kind of force that it saved for the moments when it intended to make itself remembered. The cabin waited for it. The stalks stood against the walls. The air pockets held their stillness inside the mass. And Biscuit did not move from the door. December arrived in the Wind River Basin without the gradual warning that November had provided. November had been a long, slow tightening, each day a quarter turn of a cold that was building toward something. December arrived as that something. The morning of December 9th began quietly enough that several people in the valley were caught off guard by what followed. The sky was pale and low, the kind of sky that withholds information until it is ready to deliver it. The temperature at dawn was cold, but not unusual for early December in Wyoming. Nora recorded it in James's book and added wood to the stove and made breakfast. By noon, the quiet was gone. The temperature fell 29 degrees in 3 hours. Not gradually. Not in the way cold normally moves into a valley, seeping down from the high ground and pooling in the low places. It fell like something dropped, a sudden vertical plunge that people who were outside felt first in their hands, and then in their faces, and then understood with the rest of their bodies a few seconds later. Ranch hands who had been working in shirt sleeves in the morning were pulling on everything they owned by early afternoon. Then the wind arrived. It came from the north with a speed and force that turned the snow sideways before most people had time to reach shelter. The flakes did not fall. They moved horizontally, driven with such pressure that they packed against anything facing north with the density of sand. Within an hour of the wind's arrival, fence lines had disappeared beneath the accumulating drift. Within 2 hours, the open ground between homesteads had become a white, featureless plain that gave no indication of where roads had been, or where property lines ran, or what the valley had looked like the day before. The sound was what people remembered longest afterward. It was not the sound of wind in the way wind normally sounds, moving through tree branches or rattling a loose shutter. It was a continuous low roar with a higher-pitched edge to it, the sound of something that did not intend to stop and did not care what was in its way. It pressed against every surface it encountered with the focused attention of something that had traveled a long distance and intended to account for every mile of that journey. The gusts reached 58 miles an hour by late afternoon. In the hours after dark, they pushed past 70. Silas Crow spent the first hour of the storm moving his animals into the shelter of his largest barn, working against the wind with the grim efficiency of a man who has survived Wyoming winters before and understands that the margin between sufficient effort and insufficient effort is not always visible until it is too late. He got the animals inside and barred the barn door and stood in the dark interior, listening to the structure respond to the force pressing against its walls. The barn held. He went back to the cabin. Inside, his wife had the stove running at its highest capacity. The wood stacked along the interior wall was a reassuring volume. He checked the thermometer mounted near the kitchen window and found it reading 46 degrees. He fed more wood into the stove. They ate supper and checked the thermometer again. 43 degrees, the stove was running, the wood was burning, the cold was winning anyway. He packed the gap beneath the front door with a folded blanket. He hung an additional blanket across the interior of the north-facing window. The thermometer rose 2 degrees. Then it stopped rising. Then it fell back. 41 degrees. His youngest son slept that night under 3 blankets with his coat laid across the top of them and still curled himself into a tight shape against the cold the way children do when warmth is something the body is trying to conserve rather than something it can take for granted. Silas lay awake listening to the roar outside and feeding the stove every 2 hours through the night and watching the thermometer and doing the arithmetic on the wood pile that he did not particularly want to do. 300 yards away on the other side of a fence line buried somewhere beneath the driven snow, a different situation was developing, or rather was not developing. The roar of the blizzard reached the Halstead cabin, the way sound reaches a person standing behind a thick door, present, recognizable, but stripped of its immediate force. The wind struck the outer surface of the sunflower layer and encountered several thousand dried stalk seed heads lengths of cord and the countless small air pockets preserved within the mass. A portion of its energy went into pushing the outer stalks. A portion went into finding paths through the material. The paths were there because the material was not solid, but they were short and irregular and constantly interrupted, and every interruption cost the moving air a fraction of its speed and a fraction of its cold. By the time that air reached the cabin logs, it was no longer the same air that had left the northern mountains at 70 miles an hour. The thermometer inside the Halstead cabin read 61 degrees when Nora checked it after supper. She checked it again 2 hours later. It read 60 degrees. She added a normal measure of wood to the stove, the same measure she added on any cold evening, not more. She recorded both readings in James's book. Wren sat at the table, reading by lamplight. Her posture was the relaxed posture of a child who is comfortable and absorbed in something interesting, not the contracted posture of a child managing cold. She turned pages at her own pace. She did not pull her collar up or tuck her hands beneath the table. Biscuit slept beside the stove with one ear folded over his face, breathing with the slow regularity of an animal at rest in a warm place. The roar outside continued. It pressed against the outer layer of stalks with a force that had crossed hundreds of miles of open country to arrive at this wall. The wall did not yield. It did not need to yield. It only needed to remain complicated enough that the force could not organize itself into the single concentrated blow that would matter. And it remained complicated because every stalk was a disruption, and every air pocket was a dispersal, and every inch of depth between the outer surface and the hidden logs was another measure of distance the cold had to cover before it reached what it was looking for. Sometime after midnight, Nora opened the cabin door. The wind took the door immediately, pulling it outward with a force that required her full weight against it to hold. Snow came sideways through the opening in a dense white sheet. The cold arrived in the room like something with intention, finding the warm air and pushing it back. Wren looked up from her book. Biscuit raised his head. Nora stood in the opening and looked at the north wall. What she could see of it through the driven snow was a white surface. The storm had packed snow into every space between the outer stalks and had coated the whole structure in a dense layer of frozen material. The outer face of the sunflower wall had become something else, a snow wall sealed and solid and reflecting what little light the storm produced. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stepped back inside and put her weight against the door until the latch caught. She stood for a moment with her hand still on the door, listening to the roar on the other side of it. Then she crossed to the table, opened James's book, and wrote the time and the temperature and a single additional notation. Wall holding, snow packing in, better. She closed the book and went back to the stove and added her normal measure of wood. She understood what she had seen. The snow filling the spaces in the outer layer was not damage. It was improvement. Frozen moisture was doing what it always did in wall construction, filling gaps, sealing voids, adding another layer of density between the outside air and the structure beneath. The storm was strengthening the thing it was trying to defeat. Every hour of blizzard was packing the outer layer tighter, sealing it more completely. adding insulation where the work of human hands had left small imperfections. The blizzard was finishing the wall for her. The second day was harder than the first. The temperature outside dropped further during the night and did not recover with the dawn. The wind maintained its speed without the variation that usually gives storms a rhythm, a build-up, and a slight easing and a build-up again. This one simply continued at its established force hour after hour, with the mechanical patience of something that does not experience time the way living things experience time. Silas Crow's woodpile shrank faster than it should have. By the morning of the second day, he had burned through what he had estimated would last 3 days. He made calculations. He moved the family into the single room with the stove and kept the rest of the cabin unheated. The thermometer in that room held at 44 degrees. He called that acceptable and tried to believe it. His barn held, his animals held, his family held. But the cold was inside the cabin with them in a way that cold should not be inside a cabin with a stove burning. It lived in the corners. It lived along the base of the north wall where the logs met the floor. It lived in the distance between the warmth the stove produced and the warmth a room should hold when a stove is burning in it. That distance, that gap between effort and result, was the measure of everything the cabin was failing to do. Across the fence line, buried in the snow, the Halstead cabin continued to do the thing it had been built to do since spring. The thermometer moved between 59 and 63 degrees through the second day. The stove operated at its ordinary pace. Nora made meals and recorded temperatures and read beside the lamp, and watched Wren sleep on the second evening with the loose-limbed comfort of a child who has not spent the day fighting cold. She looked at James's coat on the hook behind the door. She looked at it the way she sometimes looked at it on ordinary evenings, with the full attention of a person who has learned that the grief does not require management, and that things left unmanaged tend to find their own level. The coat had survived this storm the way it had survived all the previous winters since he had stopped wearing it. It would survive more. She thought about what he would have made of these 2 days. He had been a practical man who respected systems and distrusted noise. She thought he would have sat exactly where she was sitting beside the stove on the second night of the worst blizzard the valley had seen in years, with the thermometer holding steady and the dog asleep and the child comfortable. And he would have opened the book and written down the numbers with the same plain satisfaction that a craftsman feels when a thing he built does what he built it to do. She wrote the numbers. The blizzard released its grip on the morning of December 11th. The roar diminished, first pulling back from its sustained pitch into something more irregular, gusts and pauses rather than continuous force. Then the wind velocity dropped. Then the snow stopped moving sideways and began tentatively to fall in something closer to the direction it normally fell. By mid-morning, the sky had lightened from its storm gray into something pale and thin but recognizable as sky. By early afternoon, the mountains to the north had reappeared. The valley lay under a depth of snow that altered its topography entirely. Fence lines were gone. The road was a suggestion beneath a uniform white surface. Drifts had built against the north face of every structure in the basin, some of them reaching the roof lines of smaller outbuildings. The world was still and bright and cold in the particular way that follows a storm of that magnitude, as though the storm had exhausted the air along with everything else. Silas Crow spent an hour digging his front door free. The drift against it was shoulder-high and packed to the density that driven snow achieves when wind has compressed it for 48 hours. He worked steadily and without complaint, and eventually opened the door wide enough to step through into the white silence of the morning after. He stood outside and looked at the valley. Then he looked at the Halstead place across the buried fence line. He could see it from where he stood. The storm had coated the outer layer of the sunflower wall with a thick shell of packed snow and ice. And from a distance, the cabin had the appearance of a low, rounded mound rising from the valley floor, organic in shape, more like something the landscape had produced than something a person had built. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney in a straight vertical line, undisturbed by any remaining wind, rising cleanly into the cold, clear air. He looked at the smoke for a long moment. It was not the heavy smoke of a stove working at maximum effort against a losing battle with the cold. It was a quiet, moderate ribbon of gray that indicated a stove doing its ordinary work at its ordinary pace. It was the smoke of a warm place. He walked toward it. He moved through snow that came to his waist in the open stretches and found the buried fence line by stepping into the dip where the wire ran beneath the surface. He crossed it and continued toward the cabin, following the slight depression that indicated where the path had been. The damage to the outer layer was visible as he approached. The storm had stripped some of the outer stalks from exposed sections of the south and west faces where the wind had found angles to work against the bindings. Some of the topmost bundles along the roofline had been displaced or compressed by the accumulated weight of the snow. Here and there, frozen fibers hung loose where cords had given way under the sustained pressure. But the core layer remained. What had been lost appeared to have been the outermost portion of the structure, the first surface the storm encountered. Everything behind that first surface was intact, still dense, still packed, still doing what it had been built to do. The damage had a logic to it. The outer layer had absorbed what the storm sent at it, and the inner layer had been protected by that absorption. The thing had worked the way it was designed to work. He knocked at the door. Warm air reached him before Nora opened the door fully. It was not the aggressive warmth of a space being heated against serious cold. It was the comfortable, moderate warmth of a space that had maintained its temperature through 2 days of blizzard without significant struggle. The difference between that warmth and the warmth of his own cabin was immediately and physically apparent. Wren was at the table eating a bowl of porridge. She looked up when the door opened and nodded at him the way she nodded at most things, with the calm assessment of a child who has learned to observe before reacting. Biscuit lifted his head from beside the stove, considered Silas, and put his head back down. Nothing about the interior of the cabin suggested a household that had spent 2 days in a difficult fight. There were no blankets piled in corners, no scattered evidence of people moving things around trying to manage cold, no particular disorder that a siege produces. The lamp was burning normally. The stove was running at a normal pace. The room looked like a room on an ordinary cold December morning. Silas stood in the doorway and took this in. Then Nora stepped back and he came inside, and she crossed to the table and lifted James's book and held it out to him. He took it and sat down at the table across from Wren, who moved her bowl to the side to give him room. He opened the book and found the entries for December 9th. He read forward through the 2 days of the blizzard, following the columns of dates and times and temperatures and wood consumption. He read slowly. He was not a man who moved through numbers quickly, but he was a man who understood them when he took the time to follow them. When he finished the blizzard entries, he went back and read the entries from October and November, the weeks of construction and adjustment and repair, the steady accumulation of data that showed what the cabin had been doing through the autumn and what it had done through the storm. He closed the book and set it on the table. He stood and walked to the nearest interior wall and pressed his palm flat against the logs. He held it there. He was expecting the surface temperature of wood in a cabin that had maintained 60 degrees through a severe blizzard. What he felt was exactly that wood that was warm in the sustained way of a material that had been holding its temperature steadily, rather than losing it and recovering it and losing it again. He lowered his hand. He looked at Nora, who was standing near the stove with her arms at her sides, and her expression as unreadable as it had been since the first morning of spring when she had pressed the first sunflower seed into the soil against the cabin foundation. He said he had been wrong. He said it quietly, and without elaboration, in the way that men of his type say the hard, true things when they finally arrive at them, not dressed up, not surrounded by explanation, just placed on the table for what it was. The blizzard had already made the argument. He was only confirming the verdict. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed to the stove and picked up the kettle. She asked if he wanted coffee. He said he did. They sat at the table while Wren finished her porridge, and the thin ribbon of smoke continued rising from the chimney in the cold, clear air outside, and the valley lay white and still and changed beneath the December sky. Franklin Holt came 3 days later. He did not come the way Silas had come, with the open manner of a man arriving at a conclusion. He came the way Franklin Holt came to most things, with a particular quality of forward movement that suggested the matter under discussion was primarily a practical one, and that emotion had little to do with his interest in it. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up the path that Nora had cleared through the drifted snow. He looked at the outer layer of the sunflower wall as he passed it, studying the damage on the exposed sections and the intact sections behind them, with the evaluating eye of a man calculating something. Nora was outside repairing a section of the west-facing layer when he arrived. She did not stop working. He stood for a moment watching her hands on the bundles. Then he said he had heard about the temperatures from Silas. He said he had heard about the wood consumption. He said with the careful neutrality of a man who is changing his position without announcing that he is changing it, that he was interested in understanding the materials involved and the time required to construct a complete layer around a standard-size cabin. He asked how much cord she had used. She told him. He asked how many days the outer layer had taken to complete. She told him. He asked about the spacing between the inner face of the stalks and the logs beneath, and she explained the air channel and why it mattered, and he listened with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head while someone else is speaking. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not reference the credit he had withheld or the afternoon he had stood in her yard and delivered his judgment about her growing season. None of that entered the conversation. It did not need to. The conversation they were having was already the acknowledgement. A man who believed he had been right does not ride out in December to ask technical questions about the thing he believed was wrong. When he had the answers he had come for, he thanked her with the efficiency of a man for whom gratitude is a brief transaction rather than a sentiment. He walked back to his horse and mounted and turned toward the road. He stopped once before he reached the gate and looked back at the wall. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man revising a figure he had written down incorrectly and writing the correct one in its place. Then he rode out. Owen Brace appeared a week after that, not at the door but at the fence line in the early morning when the light was thin and flat, and the shadow of the cabin fell long across the snow. He had a small notebook with him and a length of cord. Nora watched him from the kitchen window without going outside. He measured the depth of the outer layer at several points along the south-facing wall, using the cord to gauge the distance between the outer surface and the log wall he knew was behind it. He recorded the measurements. He studied the way the bundles were oriented and the pattern of the cord that bound them and the gap at the base where the layer met the ground. He worked with the quiet concentration of a craftsman learning a new material. He did not knock on the door. He did not ask for explanation or permission or acknowledgement. He took the measurements he needed and recorded them in his notebook and walked back to his horse and rode away. He would not apologize because Owen Brace processed the world through his hands and his measurements rather than through conversation. But what he had come to record would become something. It would become modified techniques and improved methods, and eventually a way of building that he would pass to others, refined by the additions of a carpenter's 30 years of understanding how things fit together and why they fail. Neither of them needed to say anything. Some knowledge moves without words. The spring of 1885 came to the Wind River Basin the same way all Wyoming springs came, late and fast and without apology. Snow retreated from the lower ground. The creek broke free. The first green appeared along the valley floor in the tentative way of things that have survived something difficult and are not yet certain they are allowed to proceed. Silas Crow planted sunflowers against his cabin walls that spring. He did it without explanation and without announcement, pressing the seeds into the soil with the same plain directness that Nora had used the previous year. A few people noticed. Most of those who noticed did not say anything. By the following spring, 2 more families had planted the same way. The year after that, 5 more. The phrase, "the sunflower widow's cabin," faded from the valley's vocabulary. The way phrases fade when the thing they were meant to diminish has been demonstrated by events that require no commentary to have been something else entirely. What replaced it was simpler and said without any particular tone. The flower wall. Children who grew up in the valley after 1884 grew up assuming it had always been done this way. They grew up pressing seeds against cabin foundations in the spring and building the outer layer in the fall, the same way they grew up doing every other thing that simply was how things were done without reference to a time before it. They did not know about the laughter at the trading post. They did not know about Franklin Holt's credit or Owen Brace's warnings or the bidet name that the valley had hung on a widow's cabin like a verdict. They knew the wall worked. That was sufficient. Years passed in the way years pass in places where the work of each season determines the conditions of the next. Wren grew in the way children grow in those places shaped by what the land required, rather than what was merely convenient. She learned to read the temperature the way her mother read it, and to record what she observed in the way her mother had recorded it, with the understanding that numbers accumulated over time into something more than numbers. Biscuit's muzzle turned gray. His steps shortened. On warm afternoons, he slept for hours in the same patch of shade near the porch steps where he had watched Nora and Rin plant the first seeds in the spring of 1884. And in his sleep, his feet sometimes moved slightly the way dogs move when they are somewhere in memory that requires them to be in motion. James's coat still hung on the hook behind the door. It was an old coat now. The canvas had softened with years of hanging in the warmth of the cabin. The wool lining had settled into itself. It did not look like a coat that expected to be worn. It looked like a coat that had found a different purpose, one that it had not been made for, but that it fulfilled adequately, which is the fate of most things that outlast the specific use they were intended for. The book on the corner of the table had been filled long since. There were two more after it, the same system of dates and temperatures and wood consumption, the record of what the cabin was doing on every day of every season, a document that no one had asked for and no one outside the family had ever read in its entirety. But that existed the way all careful records exist, as proof that someone had been paying attention when attention mattered. Outside each summer, the ring of sunflowers grew. Tall and heavy-headed and completely ordinary to anyone who had grown up seeing them there, they stood against the cabin walls through the heat and turned their faces and dropped their seeds and dried into the amber stalks that Nora built the outer layer from each fall. The work repeated itself the way good work repeats itself, not because nothing had changed, but because the thing that had been built was worth continuing to build. Somewhere to the north, beyond the mountains that defined the basin's horizon, another winter was always organizing itself. Another season of cold was always finding its shape in the high country, gathering the particular force that it saved for the moments when it intended to test everything that had been built and every decision that had been made. When it arrived, it found walls that had learned something. Walls with a gap of still air between the outer face and the hidden logs. Walls that broke the wind into smaller pieces before the smaller pieces could become something large enough to matter. Walls that the cold reached last and found already fortified not by something that looked strong, but by something that understood how cold moved and what it was looking for and how to make the finding of it as expensive as possible. In the Wind River Basin, people stopped thinking of it as a widow's experiment. They stopped thinking of it as anything unusual at all. It became part of the way the place understood itself, one of the accumulated practical wisdoms that a community builds up over time, when enough people have paid enough attention to what works and what does not and have been willing to revise what they believed accordingly. The strongest protection, it turned out, was not always the thing that looked strongest. Sometimes wisdom arrived in the form of something that looked to the people who had not yet thought it through like nothing more than a field of flowers. And sometimes the only witness whose opinion truly mattered was the season that came each year to test what had been built. It always had an opinion. It always delivered it honestly.